An ethical exploration of barriers to research on controlled drugs. Link to the full text in the description. Federal and state agencies have powerful and important justifications for controlling access to substances that are potentially dangerous. The U.S. Drug Enforcement Agency, or DEA, controls drugs associated with a high risk of abuse. Certain drugs can cause addiction and may induce or exacerbate underlying mental illness. These hazards for individuals and society, and their potential adverse effects on communities, are good reasons for limiting access and justify careful monitoring of their use. At the same time, the absence of studies on therapeutic uses of these controlled drugs suggests that strict regulations, fear of legal consequences, stigma associated with abuse and populations using illicit drugs, and lack of funding may hinder research on their therapeutic potential. These impediments can create barriers to developing effective medications to alleviate chronic suffering and exploring harm reduction. They could obstruct research that might advance the treatment of chronic conditions or possibly have an impact on the disease itself. For the purpose of explaining the issues, we will focus on HIV as our illustrative example, because it shows the complexity of designing ethical approaches for research on controlled substances. For HIV-positive populations, the risk associated with drug use also include the spread of infection through shared syringes, interactions with prescribed medicines, and side effects such as depression. Psychotropic drugs can diminish decisional capacity and lead to increased risk-taking, which in turn can lead to HIV transmission. Chronic pain for people living with HIV is frequent, devastating, and potentially difficult to treat. Chronic pain affects 1/3 of the HIV-positive population and amounts to a significant disease burden. Heroin, marijuana, and many other illegal drugs are effective analgesics, some prescribed routinely in Europe. We tabulate their current routine, clinical, and the supporting clinical evidence in Table 1. Therapeutic potential of certain controlled substances. For many people living with HIV, chronic pain persists despite attempts at management with opioids, NSAIDs, anti-inflammatory agents, tricyclic antidepressants, and pain-modifying therapies. In addition to pain, HIV-positive patients endure multiple chronic systemic, neurological, oral, respiratory, musculoskeletal, ophthalmological, dermatological, genitourinary, and psychological symptoms. Taken together, we are sympathetic to the suffering of people living with these chronic symptoms cries out for relief. For this reason, research on effective and compassionate management of HIV-related symptoms and antiretroviral drug side effects should be a biomedical research priority, even if the potential treatment agents include controlled substances. Drug use and HIV transmission are intimately connected. Because of the high prevalence of drug use in some high-risk HIV-positive subpopulations, it is important to address the negative effects associated with illicit drug use. Developing effective treatments for pain and other symptoms associated with chronic HIV could reduce the problematic use of less effective and illicit drugs, and reduce the associated harm of HIV transmission. The therapeutic potential of controlled drugs. The abuse potential of the strongest analgesics has led the federal government to tightly control certain drugs. The DEA defines a Schedule I drug as having no currently accepted medical use and treatment in the United States. Scheduled drugs include highly controversial illicit or tightly controlled drugs like cocaine, Schedule II, and ketamine, Schedule III, some of which may have considerable therapeutic potential, as illustrated in Table 1 to be discussed at the end of this presentation. While any controlled drug can be dangerous, even the most abused and controversial drugs may have legitimate therapeutic indications. The decision to place a drug on any of these schedules is currently rather arbitrary, which is why we include all controversial controlled drugs in our decision, but focus on the most controversial substances. Their considerable therapeutic potential explains why many tightly controlled and controversial drugs are widely used in clinical practice inside and outside of the United States. Heroin, marijuana, ketamine, and cocaine have shown therapeutic benefit in randomized controlled trials and systemic reviews. Randomized controlled trials and meta-analyses found smoked marijuana to be equally or more effective for HIV-related chronic neuropathic pain than conventionally prescribed alternatives like gabapentin. Marijuana may also have therapeutic uses in appetite stimulation and nausea reduction, symptoms frequently experienced by people living with HIV. Marijuana may enhance appetite, reduce nausea, and prevent wasting, and may help in refractory epilepsy. Evidence from randomized trials trials suggest that ketamine is effective as an adjuvant therapy in the prevention and treatment of acute and chronic pain, and randomized controlled trials now also support its use in children. Ketamine may also have therapeutic use for major depression. Ibogaine and other serotonergic hallucinogens may act as addiction interrupters, antidepressive, and even anti-HIV medications. Heroin is widely prescribed in the British National Health Service for pain associated with both acute and chronic conditions, even in children and women in labor. Ecstasy and LSD may have therapeutic benefits for a wide range of conditions, including trauma, depression, and other psychological disorders. Depression is common and insidious in the HIV-positive population. The class of psychostimulant drugs may be effective in addiction interruption. Cocaine is routinely used in anesthesiology and ophthalmology. There is laboratory evidence that ibogaine and cannabinoid drugs can interfere with HIV replication, motivating the Cochrane collaboration to study the medical use of marijuana for reducing morbidity and mortality in patients with HIV and AIDS. These therapeutic effects should be studied more systematically and thoroughly. However, we can learn about the therapeutic benefit of controlled drugs only if we study them. Brief history of heroin and marijuana regulation in the Anglo-Saxon world. The legal status of marijuana is uncertain, in flux, and varies across the United States, and sometimes varies even within a state or county. In the United States, drugs of abuse are currently regulated according to Title II of the Comprehensive Drug Abuse Prevention and Control Act from 1970, known as the Controlled Substances Act, or the CSA. The CSA outlines federal guidelines for drug classification. Schedule I substances, including marijuana and heroin, are defined as having the quote-unquote highest potential for abuse, quote-unquote no currently accepted medical use, and as not having quote-unquote accepted safety for use under medical supervision. Classification under Schedule I is rarely based on scientific evidence alone. Heroin and marijuana policy are a case in point, and contrasting the history of heroin and marijuana regulation in the United States and the UK can be instructive. In the United States, very few clinical studies have investigated the therapeutic potential of heroin, while in the United Kingdom, heroin's therapeutic use has and continues to be actively studied. Early in the 20th century, as an unlisted ingredient in several effective over-the-counter medications, heroin quickly grew notorious for its addictive potential. It was then associated with leading middle-class Americans unwittingly to ruin. In response, and as part of an international effort to control the flow of opium and also enhance Sino-American relations, the United States initiated measures to limit the manufacture, importation, and prescription of opium with the Harrison Narcotics Act in 1914. The act succeeded in removing heroin from the consumer market, but an uptick in violent street crime ensued and was ascribed to heroin's thriving on the black market. In the wake of alcohol prohibition, Congress also passed a law prohibiting the importation of opium in 1924. Very little changed in the United States drug policy until the Controlled Substances Act was passed in 1970. In contrast, the United Kingdom restricted and controlled access to heroin, but continued to allow its therapeutic use when prescribed by physicians. In 1920, the British government passed the Dangerous Drugs Act, which, like the U.S. Harrison Narcotics Act of 1914, unilaterally restricted clinicians' access to heroin by making it a crime to possess, import, export, or manufacture opium without a license. Crucially, however, in 1926, the United Kingdom allowed narcotics, including heroin, to be prescribed as routine therapy. Since then, and to this day, heroin, under the name of diamorphine, continues to be on the national formulary of the UK. This policy has enabled physicians to exercise their clinical judgment in prescribing heroin and explore its therapeutic potential. Initially, indications in the United Kingdom were limited to treatment for narcotic addiction, pain relief after an attempt at cure has failed, and prescriptions for small doses to enable helpless, handicapped patients to perform tasks of daily living. Research has supported heroin's expanded uses. In the United Kingdom today, heroin is routinely administered to control labor pain and for pain control after myocardial infarction or heart attack. It is nasally administered in children to control acute pain, used for routine pain control in critically ill adults, relief of pulmonary congestion, and symptom relief for shortness of breath for patients with pulmonary edema. In 1967, the British Parliament amended the Dangerous Drug Act to include preventative measures against addiction, such as modifications in prescription writing practices and the establishment of punishment for physicians who violated these restrictions. Subsequently, those limitations were bolstered by the Misuse of Drugs Bill of 1971, which allowed the government to add or remove drugs in any class of the drug scheduling system. Through all of these legislative efforts, the United Kingdom's approach has focused on facilitating safe, clinical use of heroin. Even though the United Kingdom policy appears to be more informed by evidence than U.S. policy, it too has been criticized for grouping drugs in classes equivalent to United States Schedule I and hampering therapeutic use and research. A similar approach of blanket prohibition has characterized recent U.S. policy on marijuana. Marijuana was on the U.S. formulary until 1937. Throughout the 1930s, the Federal Bureau of Narcotics closely monitored marijuana use in public settings, and newspaper articles dramatized the dangers of marijuana. Federal Bureau of Narcotics Commissioner Harry J. Anslinger presented sensationalized newspaper clippings as proof of the harms of marijuana. Congress responded with the Marijuana Tax Act of 1937. The Tax Act required marijuana distributors, including physicians, to pay a prohibitively high tax on each of their transactions with the drug. At the time, the American Medical Association disapproved of the act, and in a statement before Congress, their consultant Dr. William C. Woodward testified against the inflammatory and dubious anecdotal evidence used to support the Marijuana Tax Act. Woodward advocated unsuccessfully for the inclusion of marijuana under the Harrison Act of 1914 instead. Such a policy would have limited the use and production of the drug while still making it possible for clinicians to prescribe it. The passage of the Marijuana Tax Act was followed in 1951 by the Boggs Act, which imposed and increased minimum sentencing for all drug violations. The idea behind mandatory minimums was that imposing harsh punishment for the use or possession of mild gateway drugs like marijuana. The idea behind mandatory minimums was that imposing harsh punishment for the use or possession of mild, quote-unquote, gateway drugs like marijuana would discourage the use of stronger drugs and thereby forestall addiction. During Lyndon B. Johnson's presidency, a special presidential committee was unable to confirm or refute the claim that marijuana use led to violence or heroin addiction, but the regulations have remained in place and the Controlled Substances Act was passed in 1970. These views may incorporate attitudes towards racial minorities, our society's support for the war on drugs, fears of addiction, and stereotypes of people who inject drugs or recreational substances. In addition, enforcement to drug laws appears to target racial minorities and socially stigmatized groups. The call for reform. Since these regulations have been in place, scientists and journalists have repeatedly questioned the U.S. drug scheduling system. As recently as June 2014, investigators writing in the New England Journal of Medicine complained that a lack of data about the adverse effects of marijuana use. We and they noticed the catch-22 of U.S. drug policy, which defines marijuana as having no, quote-unquote, accepted medical use, while obstructing efforts to investigate whether or not it actually has medical uses. In the same vein, editors at Scientific American repeatedly called U.S. marijuana regulation policy outdated and pronounced that it thwarts legitimate research. And editors at Nature implored researchers to prioritize research on marijuana. Recently, a series of critics have made similar points. Joseph S. Albert pointed out that much of what we know about cannabis comes from folktales and limited clinical observation. As part of an editorial series on marijuana legalization, the New York Times cited the clear consensus of science that marijuana is far less harmful to human health than other banned drugs. The Gainesville Sun editorial board and its editorial Allow Pot Research wrote that cannabis research is thin due to onerous federal restrictions. And the Washington Post reported on U.S. veterans' attempts to convince the Department of Veterans Affairs of the legitimacy of marijuana as a treatment option. All of these articles demanded evidence-based evaluations of the benefits and harms of controlled substance regulations and the U.S. drug scheduling system itself. In sum, these critical assessments point out that across the U.S., people are talking about medical marijuana, but nobody knows what it's good for. Catch-22. The limited guidance on using regulated drugs for treatment of pain associated with HIV is typically not evidence-based and often politically biased. The The result is a classic catch-22 situation. There is scant evidence on the therapeutic effectiveness of controlled substances for the treatment of HIV symptoms because there are few studies. There are few studies of the effectiveness of these drugs because they're tightly regulated and considered to lack medical benefit. Systematic and thorough research on controlled drugs has the potential to provide patients living with HIV with therapeutic benefit as treatment of chronic disease-related symptoms. Beyond this promise, studies can also produce significant harm reduction. Because many chronic pain patients self-medicate and self-manage their pain outside of the healthcare system, information from studies would help to avoid overuse and misuse of ineffective drugs, and the self-medication misuse of illicit drugs. Better prevention or treatment of addiction would curtail the secondary harm, including the spread of HIV disease. Increased knowledge about the therapeutic benefit of substances currently classified as Schedule 1, 2, or 3 could lead to improved treatment options for HIV-positive patients and thus reduce their abuse of inefficient or illegal alternatives. Information from studies of these drugs could reduce cost burdens on the healthcare system by promoting the prescription of effective treatments, reducing inappropriate drug use, optimizing and integrating indicated administration of controlled substances, and avoiding the untoward societal effects associated with illegal drug use. Some argue that many controlled drugs would be significantly cheaper if legal and more accessible for resource-poor populations. Furthermore, scientific information on the effectiveness of controlled drugs as treatment could reduce the stigma associated with their use. That information could in turn reduce the stigmatization of those who use the drugs and thereby enhance their opportunities for gainful employment and meaningful social participation. Social and ethical barriers to studies that administer controlled drugs. Many people in our society, including people who review studies, seem to have developed attitudes about substances such as marijuana, ketamine, and heroin. These views may incorporate attitudes towards racial minorities, support of the war on drugs, fears of addiction, and stereotypes of drug users and addicts. Such views expressed in laws, rules, and regulations may have the effect of impeding research on controlled drugs. More generally, biases and prejudices may be an impediment to valid research. Other barriers to research on these agents are both perceived and real. Some concern the fear of legal prosecution even in jurisdictions where medicinal or recreational use has been legalized. Others involve skepticism about the efficacy of agents that are defined as having, quote-unquote, no currently accepted medical use in treatment, and create suspicion among institutional review board members. Researchers, institutions, IRBs, funding, and regulatory agencies may also be concerned about their reputations. Such worries can deter people from undertaking studies on the effectiveness of these agents. Fear of running afoul of the law or harming one's standing may also have an effect on the evaluation of studies that involve controlled drugs. These attitudes may affect funding agencies' decisions about projects. Indeed, the National Institute of Drug Abuse, the NIH institute tasked with funding research on drug addiction, is focused on investigating drug-related harms and reduction, but not therapeutic benefits of Schedule 1 drugs. In the words of its director, Nora Volkow, it is, quote-unquote, not NIDA's mission to study the medicinal use of marijuana. Selection of participants for these trials will present unique ethical challenges for those who evaluate study proposals. HIV-positive populations include current and former users of controlled substances, as well as people who have never or rarely used controlled drugs. Consideration of these groups of potential study participants will complicate the evaluation of standard research ethics questions. For example, are current, past, or non-users capable of providing informed consent for a study that involves their using a controlled drug? Is one group more vulnerable to addiction, abuse, or relapse, and in need of special protections than the others? Can a certificates of confidentiality issued by the NIH adequately protect the confidentiality of participants potentially incriminating substance use? Does drug experience convey more or less capacity to assess the risks and benefits involved in a study that involves controlled drugs? Are the risks to current, past, or non-users more or less reasonable? Would the invitation to enroll in a study that provides controlled drugs constitute an undue inducement? Views on these questions may differ significantly between the various stakeholders in the research process, and they may vary significantly based on the hearsay reputation associated with a particular drug. Reviewers will need evidence-based guidance on how to respond to such questions when studies with controlled substances are proposed. To date, the ethical factors involved in research using controlled drugs have not been well described, recommendations have not been well developed, and there is almost no evidence-based guidance on how to assess these factors and proceed. Little has been published on attitudes that may constitute barriers to research on controlled drugs. A few studies have surveyed physician attitudes towards prescribing Schedule I drugs. A 1984 paper reported variable and diverging attitudes towards heroin among researchers, clinicians, and authorities, while advocating for research on the drug's pharmacological and clinical properties. A 1994 paper that explored attitudes on long-term opiate prescription for chronic pain found concern about tolerance, dependence, and addiction varied significantly depending on specialty, prescribing habits, region, and regulatory pressure to elicit their concerns about prescribing heroin. He reported that the majority had no reservations about either prescribing or addiction. A 2011 Canadian focus group study explored the views of women who use illegal drugs on decisional capacity, stigma, and undue inducement in the context of research. That study found that the views of the surveyed women differed from prevailing attitudes in IRBs. This minimal amount of evidence suggests that physicians, patients, and regulatory bodies' attitudes towards controlled drugs are homogeneous, while the dearth of studies on the therapeutic use of controlled drugs suggests that there are barriers. Cohen reviewed the Controlled Substances Act and FDA regulations related to research on medical uses of marijuana and proposed that, quote, the ability of scientists to conduct impartial studies has been greatly hampered by political considerations, end quote. The Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies exposed barriers to research on Schedule I drugs in the United States. Their memorandum maintains that the process for conducting research into the medical uses of marijuana is obstructed by federal agencies blocking the supply of marijuana for clinical research and by guidelines and requirements created by the Department of Health and Human Services that apply solely to marijuana research. Abrams reported on multiple barriers to research and the difficulties he had in procuring marijuana for a study of treatment for HIV neuropathy. Ethical concerns. Policymakers need to consider all of the harms and benefits that are likely to result from any regulation that limits access to and research on specific drugs. Among these harms and benefits, they need to reflect on whether and how the policy in question would limit liberty or disproportionately burden some individuals and thereby raise concerns about justice. Although the imposition of limitations on liberty and other societal burdens may be reasonable given the other benefits that they provide, policies with such effects, such as those bearing on research with controlled drugs, require justification and, when possible, should be informed by empirical data. For example, are the restrictions on individual and institutional liberty posed by restrictive drug policies justified by their benefits? Do such policies impose burdens on some populations more than others, thereby creating justice concerns? Liberty. Considerations of liberty are involved in the political questions of when and why some infringements on personal freedom are justified. We allow physicians broad freedom to administer drugs without recognized benefit, provided they obtain their patient's informed consent. We allow the patient the freedom to refuse even life-saving interventions, as long as they have decisional capacity. Significantly, researchers typically have the liberty to question established truth. Some indeed consider this their calling. In contrast, the U.S. Food and Drug Administration and other federal laws and agencies limits these liberties, as well as manufacturers' liberties, in marketing drugs that requires that substances be shown to both be safe and effective before they be marketed and prescribed. FDA regulations are among federal regulations aiming at protecting and promoting health, promoting and maintaining well-being, and assuring that the public is protected from pharmaceutical products that are unsafe or ineffective, but by necessity do so at the expense of limiting research and commercial liberties. At the same time, these valuable regulations limit the array of substances that may be used freely by individuals for medicinal use, and thereby limit liberty. Justice. The formal principle of justice requires treating like cases alike and different cases differently. This principle would be easy to satisfy if it were possible to tell which factors were ethically salient for determining that cases were alike and which differences were irrelevant and could be ignored. In drug research, questions of social justice can be subtle and difficult to sort out, whereas some conditions may be alleviated by a Schedule II or III substance, e.g. morphine. Other conditions may only respond to a substance currently under Schedule I, e.g. marijuana. Is it just to allow research on a substance that may alleviate the pain of some patients and limit or prohibit research on a different substance that may alleviate the pain of other patients? When may research on a substance be limited and why? Who will be affected by a limitation, and will their share of burdens be fair? Concerns of liberty and justice apply across morality. A number of additional issues specific to research ethics have, however, become key points for consideration in the review of protocols by funding agencies and institutional review boards. Several of these issues are likely to be especially complicated and controversial in the context of studies of controlled drugs on patients who are HIV positive. Risks. Out of concern for protecting research subjects from unreasonable risk, studies are required to minimize risks, and institutional review boards are charged with balancing the study risks and potential benefits so as to determine whether they are reasonable. The risk-benefit assessment in studies of controlled drugs on people who are HIV positive will be especially difficult and complex. It is not clear when the risks of addiction and other harms associated with drug use are worth the potential benefit of alleviating burdensome symptoms. Furthermore, exaggerated risks informed by media and urban legend may distort judgment of actual risks. It is also not obvious whether the risks for a drug user are greater or less than the risks to a former drug user or non-user. Legal risks also have to be added to the physical, psychological, social, and privacy concerns that are to be taken into account in the risk-benefit assessments. Decisions about the acceptability of a study should be informed by an accurate picture of potential legal consequences related to study participation, as well as the legal exposure of investigators and institutions. Informed consent. Informed consent is a critically important condition for the ethical conduct of research. Yet it is not apparent whether patients who are currently or formerly using drugs are capable of providing informed consent. Patients are deemed to lose capacity to consent to a change in their surgical procedure after mild sedation in the operating room. At the same time, heavily medicated women with labor pain are considered capable of consenting to both research and interventions, as are patients who chronically use anxiolytic and pain medication. Thus, it is not clear whether the potential subjects in studies on therapeutic uses of controlled substances are capable of giving informed consent if they're using controlled substances. Are those who use drugs more like these who we consider intoxicated, or like those with an underlying mental condition that does not impair their decisional capacity? Would people with a history of drug use be more or less informed because of their personal experience with controlled drugs? Undue inducements. In her 1981 paper, Ruth Macklin argued that offers of great benefits could overwhelm people's decisional capacity and compromise their judgment of risks and benefits to such an extent as to render them incapable of providing informed consent. Macklin declared that such inducements are undue and should be prohibited. That position has been vigorously debated in the subsequent literature, and at least one study provides evidence that inducements do not impede judgment. In the context of research on controlled drugs, we anticipate that the issue of undue inducement will be raised. Reviewers are likely to ponder whether the offer of drugs to drug users would constitute an undue inducement. Similar questions about the undue inducement of providing drugs to drug users in research were directly addressed in a case discussed by Louis Charland in a 2002 paper, Cynthia's Dilemma, Consenting to Heroin Prescription. Most, but not all, of the numerous commentaries published along with the paper agreed with Charland that the inducement of providing clean needles and free heroin in that case was undue, and that subjects could not provide consent. To make appropriate ethical decisions about policy for conducting research with Schedule I substances, institutional review board members, researchers, potential participants, and funding agencies need a clear picture of how these issues are involved. Yet, separating bias from fact is difficult. Research policy decisions are further complicated by thinking about the three groups of potential participants in a Schedule I substance study. For example, are people who have had personal experience using drugs better informed than others, or are they incapable of making a decision involving drug use because their desire for the drug is irresistible? For someone who has never been a drug user, are the risks associated with participating in a trial of the controlled drug greater or less than they would be for a current user or a former user? And is someone who has no personal experience with drug use and who does not personally know people who use drugs informed enough to make these judgments? Should cash incentives for participation in clinical trials be different for current, former, and drug-naive users? Evidence on whether and how bias affects judgment about these matters will be critical for the development of rational, fact-based policies to guide research on controlled drugs. The marginal level of attention indicates that research is needed to provide an accurate basis for research. In addition, because we have identified only a single study that compares different stakeholder views on issues in research ethics, more in-depth and systematic investigation is in order. Systematic and comprehensive studies would reveal whether and how the views of disparate groups differ. Institutional review board members, researchers, clinicians, and people who are living with the conditions and symptoms that require attention. Each group has its own expertise and perspective. Areas of difference, as well as areas of consensus, are likely to be instructive. The empirical data combined with an overview of the legal status quo would provide a sound basis for recommending policy changes that would facilitate research on controlled drugs. It's instructive to examine the issues discussed above in light of recent work on the psychology of judgment and decision-making by Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky, D.T. Gilbert, and T.D. Wilson. In their widely accepted work on normal human psychology, these psychologists have established a cognitive basis for common human errors and explained how frequently human judgment is infected with bias. We have only identified 5 papers that apply their robust findings to bioethics. None of these articles address issues in research ethics, yet it may be especially important to be aware of distortions in judgment that reflect cognitive basis when formulating policy recommendations for research with Schedule I substances. If empirical studies identify contradictory stakeholder judgments, the view of at least one group may reflect bias. Inconsistent views could be compared to the scientific literature to discern which views have a basis in fact and which are likely to represent cognitive distortion. Such an innovative approach to resolving controversies in bioethics would be useful in guiding policy recommendations. Specifically, studies designed for guiding policy research with Schedule I drugs should focus on answering the following questions. 1. Is there general agreement or are there differences in the views of stakeholder groups on the potential subject's decisional capacity, ability to assess risks and benefits, vulnerability, and susceptibility to inducement? 2. Is there agreement or are there differences in judgment regarding the acceptable degree of risk exposure for the 3 groups of possible subjects, namely current drug users, former drug users, and non-drug users? 3. Is there agreement or are there differences in judgment regarding the degree of risks and the overall acceptability of specific studies with respect to drugs that have different social connotations and drugs that differ in their addictive potential or health risks? Study findings of a clear consensus on an issue of research ethics could offer a starting point for policy development. Scientific evidence that supports one of 2 opposing views will provide evidence to support data-based recommendations. When the views of different groups differ, there may not be empirical data to support one position or the other. In some cases, the alignment of views, for instance with patients versus professionals, or people with direct experience versus those lacking direct experience, may be enlightening. In other cases, after identifying the disparity in views, the only reasonable solution may be to call for more scientific investigation. The key caveat for policymakers will be to remain mindful of these possibilities and careful to avoid drawing conclusions that the data does not support. Conclusions. Social views about marijuana have been changing rapidly. Its legal status is in flux, and views about its safety and efficacy will continue to evolve. The issues that we have identified are certainly relevant to the need for research on the efficacy and safety of marijuana. Our point, however, is broader. It is likely that several drugs currently classified under Schedule I have important therapeutic potential for the relief of symptoms, as well as for the management of the underlying chronic conditions. Without research, that potential cannot be detected or verified, and the potential benefits cannot be dispersed. The catch-22 of the status quo is that the classification of drugs as Schedule I amounts to an insurmountable barrier to research. As matters of liberty and justice, changes are needed in FDA and DEA policies so as to make research on substances currently classified as Schedule I more feasible and less restricted. At the same time, because the research will involve concerns about the ethical conduct of research, the specific issues related to such research need to be carefully identified and considered. And because views about issues related to drugs, drug users, and addictions are likely to be infected with bias, and because conflicts of interest are likely to affect the judgment of an institutional review board member as well as clinicians and researchers, policymakers need to hold fast to requiring evidence for guiding their recommendations and avoid pronouncements that are not supported by data. Policymakers should seek and employ study findings as the basis, deciding how existing regulations should be revised and in offering their recommendations. Their clear goal must be to allow research to proceed on regulated drugs in accordance with the highest ethical standards and without being swayed by political agendas, preconceptions, or prejudices. Institutional review boards that are not responsible for reviewing studies of Schedule I drugs, investigators who are interested in conducting studies, and funding institutes and agencies that sponsor such research should also be aware of the need for an evidentiary basis for grounding their decisions.